in quiet moments when the day is already over. It's associated with rest, with patience, with hands moving almost on their own, the kind of repetitive motion that calms the nervous system, the kind of rhythm that lowers the heart rate, the kind of activity neuroscientists associate with reduced cortisol, steadier attention, and easier transitions into sleep. Knitting is often recommended as a way to relax, as a way to quiet racing thoughts, as a way to help the mind release the day and prepare for rest. Studies on attention and focus suggest that repetitive, low-stakes tasks like knitting gently anchor the mind. They reduce mental noise, soften vigilance, and allow attention to drift without becoming lost. A rare balance between focus and ease, between being awake and letting go. But that softness has a way of hiding something much larger. Because beneath the calm surface, knitting has always been an economic system. Long before it was a pastime, it was labor. Before it was self-care, it was income. Before it was cozy, it was commerce. For centuries, knitting quietly supported households, funded communities, and moved goods through early markets. It operated without factories at first, relying instead on time, skill, and repetition. One stitch after another, one garment after another, small work, multiplied at scale. This contrast is easy to miss. Softness paired with scale, repetition paired with revenue, calm hands sustaining real economies. And that is what this story is about. Not a tutorial, not a trend piece, but a slow, thoughtful exploration of a quiet industry that has been hiding in plain sight, one that continues to generate value, meaning, and comfort in a restless modern world. If you're listening to this to wind down, to rest, or to fall asleep, you're in the right place. And if you're curious how something so gentle became something so enduring, this story is already beginning. Knitting may seem small. It happens quietly, often alone, measured in hours rather than headlines, but longevity has a way of revealing what truly matters. Knitting has endured for centuries, not because it was trendy, but because it was useful, because it adapted, because it could survive wars, economic shifts, technological change, and the rise of entirely new industries. Few forms of work show this kind of resilience. Knitting moved from necessity to trade, from trade to industry, from industry to hobby, and then quietly back into business again. Each time reshaping itself to fit the world it found. Its scale is easy to miss because it lives inside intimacy, inside homes, inside small shops, inside hands. But across those quiet spaces, real economies formed. Goods were produced, skills were passed down, markets emerged, value was created, not through speed or volume, but through patience and repetition. At different moments in history, knitting has been labor, it has been income, it has been culture, it has been technology, adapting to machines, to new materials, to digital platforms without losing its core. This is not a niche story. It is a foundational one, a story about how human scale work can endure inside large systems, about how calm, repetitive effort can sustain both people and economies over time. And as the modern world grows louder and faster, the quiet lessons embedded in knitting may be more relevant than ever. Before there were markets, before there were brands, before prices were printed or logos were stitched into fabric, there was need. Warmth was not optional. Protection from the elements was not decorative. It was survival. In the earliest human communities, clothing was not chosen. It was required. Cold determined behavior, weather-shaped daily life, and the ability to transform raw material into something wearable often meant the difference between endurance and exposure. Knitting emerged in this space, not as art, not as leisure, but as function. It was a way to turn wool, hair, and fiber into insulation, a way to create garments that flexed, stretched, and held warmth close to the body, a way to respond, slowly and patiently, to the demands of climate and daily labor. Knitted items were not isolated projects, they were part of the rhythm of life. Hands moved while conversations unfolded, stitches accumulated alongside chores, meals, and long evenings. Knitting fit into existence the way breathing did, steady, repetitive, and largely unnoticed. There was no separation between living and making, no distinction between craft and work. What was produced by hand was produced because it was necessary. In this early context, knitting was not yet a business, but it was already productive. Each garment represented hours of labor. Each stitch represented attention. Each finished piece represented stored time, time that could now be worn, traded, or passed on. Value existed long before currency named it, and slowly, almost without intention, this necessity began to form something recognizable. A cottage economy. Production moved inward, into homes, kitchens, and shared spaces. Knitting became something done where people lived, not where industries gathered. There were no factories, no centralized locations, just countless small points of production spread across villages and regions. This decentralization mattered because it meant knitting could be done alongside life. It did not require land ownership, physical strength, or access to expensive tools. It required skill, patience, and time, resources that many people, especially women, could control more easily than property or capital. As knitted goods accumulated, they began to move, at first through barter, a pair of socks exchanged for food, a hat traded for labor, a garment offered in return for shelter or supplies. Knitted items traveled quietly from household to household, village to village. Their value was understood intuitively. Warmth could be felt, durability could be tested, fit could be judged by touch alone. Over time, informal trade became more structured. Markets formed, regular exchange points emerged. Certain knitters became known for their quality, their speed, or their patterns. Knitting shifted, subtly, from pure necessity into income. This transition did not happen all at once. There was no announcement, no clear dividing line. But slowly, knitting became something that could support a household, something that could supplement farming income, something that could be relied upon during lean seasons. Importantly, knitting was not framed as leisure. It was labor, and labor that could be done indoors, labor that could be done year-round, labor that scaled with time rather than land. For many families, knitted goods became a stabilizing force, predictable, dependable, and renewable. As long as fiber could be sourced and hands could move, production could continue. This is one of the earliest examples of what we would now call home-based manufacturing. The cottage economy did not rely on speed, it relied on consistency, and at its core was skill. In a world without mass production, skill was currency. Time mattered, but skill mattered more. A skilled knitter could produce garments faster, stronger, and more reliably. They understood tension, structure, durability. They knew how a garment would behave after weeks of wear. They knew how to repair mistakes before they weakened the whole. This knowledge was not written down. It was learned through repetition, through observation, through failure. And because it took time to acquire, it held value. Years of refinement and generations of shared technique. This is why handmade items were trusted. They were not anonymous. They were traceable to a person, a household, a reputation. Quality was enforced socially, not contractually. If a garment failed, its maker was known. If it endured, so did their standing in the community. This trust created early brand-like dynamics long before branding existed. Certain knitters were sought out. Certain regions became associated with particular styles or strengths. Certain goods commanded better trades, and all of it was driven by human attention. Knitting required focus, but not urgency, patience, but not strain. The same qualities that make knitting calming today were the qualities that made it productive then. Repetition created reliability. Rhythm created output. Calm created consistency. This is an important point. Knitting's economic power did not come from speed. It came from sustainability. It allowed people to work for long periods without exhaustion, to produce value without burning out, to integrate labor into daily life rather than separating it from living. In modern terms, knitting was an early example of resilient labor, and because of this, it endured. As societies grew more complex, knitting adapted. It moved into guilds, into regulated trades, into markets with rules and standards, but it never lost its foundation. It remained rooted in skill, in time, in human attention. Before factories, before corporations, before brands, knitting had already proven something fundamental. That small, patient work, repeated steadily, could sustain lives, communities, and economies. And that lesson would carry forward quietly into everything that followed. For most of history, work and income were tightly controlled, property was inherited, trades were regulated, opportunities were limited, and often reserved. For women in particular, paths to financial independence were few. In many societies, women were legally restricted from owning land, joining formal trades, or entering guilds. Paid labor outside the home was rare, closely monitored, or socially discouraged. Economic participation, when it existed at all, was often indirect, tied to a husband's work, a family business, or seasonal labor. The domestic sphere was not seen as productive in an economic sense. It was necessary but invisible, essential but unpaid. And yet, within that space, certain forms of work quietly generated value. Knitting was one of them, because knitting did not require leaving the home. It did not require land ownership or formal apprenticeship. It did not demand physical strength or expensive tools. It required time, skill, attention, and those were resources many women already managed every day. Knitting fit into the domestic economy naturally. It could be done alongside childcare, cooking, and household labor. It did not interrupt life, it folded into it. Hands could work while conversations unfolded. Production could continue in moments that would otherwise be lost. This mattered because it meant knitting could become income without breaking social boundaries. It did not challenge norms directly. It worked within them, quietly converting domestic time into economic output. In this way, knitting became an exception. While many forms of paid work were inaccessible, knitting remained open. Women could produce goods, set informal prices, and participate in exchange, often without needing permission or institutional approval. A finished garment carried value regardless of who made it. Warmth did not depend on gender. Durability did not ask questions. And so, through knitting, many women entered the economy in subtle but meaningful ways. They sold socks, hats, and garments at markets. They traded goods directly with neighbors. They contributed to household income during difficult seasons. In some cases, knitting income made the difference between survival and scarcity. Importantly, this work was not framed as empowerment, it was framed as necessity. But over time, necessity created experience, and experience created confidence. Women who knitted for income learned to manage time, materials, and output. They learned which goods sold reliably, which patterns were durable, which markets paid fairly. They developed informal business instincts, pricing, quality control, reputation management, long before those concepts had names. This knowledge was passed down. Mothers taught daughters, neighbors taught neighbors. Techniques spread through observation rather than instruction. And because knitting was repeatable, scalable through time, and resilient to disruption, it endured across generations. Even as formal economies grew more rigid, knitting remained flexible. It could contract during hardship and expand during opportunity. It could supplement income without requiring complete dependence on it. This flexibility is what allowed knitting to persist when other paths closed. In a world where women's labor was often dismissed or constrained, knitting quietly created space. Not loudly, not rebelliously, but persistently. It transformed domestic skill into economic contribution. It turned time into value, and it allowed women to participate in commerce long before they were formally invited. This was not independence in the modern sense, but it was agency. And that distinction matters because it explains why knitting would later become one of the first forms of work where women operated businesses of their own, small, informal, and deeply rooted in skill. That story is what comes next. As knitting moved beyond pure necessity, something subtle began to happen. Garments were no longer made only for use within the household. They were made with exchange in mind. Finished pieces began to appear at local markets, folded carefully, stacked simply, offered alongside food, tools, and other handmade goods. Socks, caps, mittens, and sweaters moved from private spaces into public ones, and with that movement came decision-making. What to make, how much time to spend, which materials to use, and what a finished piece should be worth. Even without formal training, knitters were making economic choices. Time became something to manage. Hours spent knitting had to fit around other responsibilities. Faster patterns meant more output. Slower, more intricate work meant higher value, but required patience and planning. Materials had to be considered. Wool varied in quality and availability. Some fibers were easier to work with, others produced stronger or warmer garments. Choosing one over another affected durability, comfort, and price. Inventory, though not called that, existed. Finished garments needed to be stored, offered at the right time of year, repaired if flaws appeared, held back or brought forward depending on demand. Knitters learned, through experience, what sold consistently and what did not. Markets were teachers. If an item sold quickly, its value was confirmed. If it sat untouched, adjustments were made. Patterns changed. Materials shifted. Prices were reconsidered. Pricing itself was a careful balance. Too low, and the labor disappeared into the exchange. Too high, and the garment remained unsold. Knitters learned to read their communities, to understand what people needed, what they could afford, and what they were willing to trade for warmth and durability. Reputation mattered. A well-made garment carried more than its function. It carried trust. Buyers remembered whose socks lasted longest, whose sweaters held their shape, whose work justified its cost. This created early brand recognition, personal rather than corporate, a name spoken quietly at market. A recommendation passed between neighbors, a preference formed over time. None of this was formalized. There were no ledgers or marketing plans, but the instincts were there. Knitters adjusted production based on seasons. They prepared for colder months. They anticipated demand. They paced their work to avoid exhaustion. They were managing resources, time, materials, and attention in ways that closely resemble modern small business practice. And they did this without language to describe it. Knitting allowed people, especially women, to operate at the intersection of domestic life and commerce. It did not require abandoning one for the other. It allowed business to exist quietly within the flow of daily life. This balance was powerful. It meant income could be generated without disrupting social structures. It meant economic participation could grow organically rather than through permission. And over time, these small decisions accumulated. What began as individual effort became shared practice. What began as survival became strategy. Knitting had crossed an important threshold. It was no longer only work. It was enterprise. And the value of that enterprise rested on something deeper than output alone. It rested on skill. Long before formal rights existed, there were informal freedoms. Before contracts, before legal recognition, before political voice. There were small spaces where autonomy could still take root. Knitting created one of those spaces. In a world where most economic power was inherited or granted, knitting allowed individuals, particularly women, to generate income on their own terms. Not through ownership of land or membership in institutions, but through skill and time. This mattered more than it appeared, because economic independence often comes before political change. It begins quietly in daily decisions. How time is spent, how value is created, how resources are managed. Knitting offered a form of early self-employment. There was no employer in the modern sense, no overseer, no schedule imposed from outside. The knitter controlled the pace, the output, the quality. Work could expand when needed and contract when it could not. Production adjusted to seasons, health, family demands, and material availability. This flexibility was rare in other forms of labor, and it provided something subtle but important: choice. Even small amounts of independent income changed household dynamics. It reduced total dependence. It allowed contributions to be made directly rather than indirectly. It created a measure of agency within constrained systems. This was not independence as ideology. It was independence as function. Knitting income was often modest, but it was reliable. It did not vanish with bad harvests or temporary disruptions. As long as materials could be sourced and hands could move, production continued. That reliability understood how much work was required to meet certain needs. They learned how to plan ahead. They adjusted effort based on circumstance rather than command. This self-directed labor-shaped identity. A person who produces value consistently, even quietly, begins to see themselves differently. Skill becomes something owned rather than borrowed. Time becomes something invested rather than spent. And this internal shift matters because it lays the groundwork for later participation. When formal opportunities eventually expand, those who have already been practicing autonomy are prepared to step into them. Knitting did not challenge systems openly. It did not organize or protest. It simply persisted, and persistence has its own power. Across generations, knitting knowledge was passed down alongside practical lessons: how to price work fairly, how to recognize quality, how to manage efforts sustainably. These lessons were embedded in practice rather than theory. Daughters learned not only how to knit, but how to work. Neighbors shared patterns and information. Communities developed informal standards. All of this created economic literacy without formal education. Knitting functioned as a quiet training ground for self-employment, a way to practice responsibility, consistency, and independence in small, manageable steps. It is important to recognize this for what it was. Not a symbolic gesture, not a footnote, but a real, functioning economic pathway. Knitting allowed people to participate in commerce before they were formally included. It created a bridge between domestic labor and public exchange, one that did not require permission to cross. This quiet power explains why knitting endured when other paths closed. It adapted because it belonged to individuals, not institutions. And it explains why, centuries later, knitting would reemerge so naturally in modern forms of independent work, small businesses, digital creators, local shops, all rooted in the same principles of skill, time, and autonomy. What began as necessity became income. What became income became agency. And all of it happened without noise, without declarations, without recognition. Just hands, working steadily, creating value. As knitting spread across regions, something began to change. What had once been informal, personal, and largely invisible started to become organized. Markets grew more regular, trade routes expanded, demand became more predictable, and with that growth came a familiar pressure, the need for consistency. Buyers wanted garments that lasted. Merchants wanted reliability. Communities wanted standards they could trust. This is where guilds entered the story. Knitting guilds emerged as early attempts to bring order to a growing craft economy. They were not corporations in the modern sense, but they served a similar purpose, regulating quality, controlling training, and defining who could produce goods for sale. At their core, guilds were about trust. They established expectations around materials, technique, and durability. A garment made under guild standards carried an assurance that it would hold its shape, survive wear, and meet the needs it was designed for. This was early quality control. There were no factories, no inspection departments, no written guarantees. Instead, quality was enforced socially. Guild members were accountable to one another. Poor workmanship reflected not just on the individual, but on the group. Reputation mattered, and so did consistency. To maintain these standards, guilds formalized learning. Apprenticeships became the primary way skills were passed on. New knitters learned under experienced hands, often for years, before producing goods independently. Technique, efficiency, and discipline were taught slowly through repetition rather than instruction manuals. This system protected knowledge. It ensured that skills were not diluted as demand increased. It created a shared language of practice, a way to recognize good work without needing to explain it. But guilds also regulated access. They determined who could sell, where goods could be offered, and under what conditions. In some regions, selling knitted goods without guild affiliation was restricted or discouraged. This limited competition stabilized prices and protected established producers, but it also narrowed opportunity. What had once been open and informal became selective. This regulation brought benefits. Quality improved. Markets became more predictable. Consumers developed confidence in standardized goods, but it also introduced tension. Guild membership often required fees, sponsorship, or social standing. Not everyone who could knit well was allowed to participate fully. Especially for women, access to guilds was uneven, sometimes permitted, often limited, sometimes denied entirely. And so, knitting existed in two parallel forms: inside guilds, regulated and recognized; outside them, informal but persistent. This dual structure is important. It shows how knitting adapted as economies grew more complex. It also reveals a pattern that would repeat many times: informal work becoming formalized and then fragmenting again. Guilds marked an early attempt to turn craft into industry, to impose structure on something deeply human and variable. They brought order, they brought legitimacy, and they brought limits. Knitting was no longer only a domestic practice or small enterprise. It was now part of a regulated economic system, one that balanced skill, control, and trust. This shift would shape everything that followed. As knitting became more organized, attention shifted upstream, toward materials, toward supply, toward the origins of the fiber itself. Wool was not just a raw input, it was a strategic resource. Sheep farming shaped landscapes long before it shaped markets. Certain regions were naturally suited to grazing, with climates and terrain that supported large flocks. Over time, these regions became known for the quality and consistency of their wool. This was the beginning of specialization. Some areas produced coarse wool, ideal for durability and warmth. Others produced finer fibers, better suited for garments worn close to the skin. These differences mattered. They affected how yarn behaved, how long garments lasted, and how much they could be traded for. Wool became more than material. It became identity. Regions developed reputations based on their flocks. Merchants learned where to source particular fibers. Knitters adapted their techniques to the wool available to them. Patterns evolved around material constraints. This interconnectedness turned wool into a traded commodity. Raw fleece moved from farms to processing centers. It was cleaned, spun, and prepared for use, sometimes locally, sometimes far from where it was grown. This movement created early supply chains, long before the term existed. Trade routes followed the fiber. Paths that once carried food or tools began to carry wool. Markets expanded beyond local boundaries. A knitter in one town might work with fiber sourced hundreds of miles away. This movement mattered. It introduced variability. It introduced dependence. It introduced opportunity. Regions that produced high-quality wool gained economic leverage. Areas without grazing land became dependent on trade. Prices fluctuated based on weather, flock health, and political stability. Wool connected distant places. It tied rural landscapes to urban markets. It linked shepherds to merchants. It connected home-based production to international trade. And because wool was essential for clothing, insulation, and survival, it held steady demand. This made it valuable, not volatile like luxury goods, not seasonal like crops, but consistent. Wool became a form of economic insurance. It could be stored, transported, and processed over time. Its value did not disappear quickly. This stability made it attractive to traders and institutions alike. As knitting economies grew, control over wool became increasingly important. Access to quality fiber influenced production capacity. It determined what kinds of goods could be made, how durable they would be, and what markets they could enter. In this way, knitting was never just about technique. It was about resources, geography, logistics. The simple act of knitting rested on a complex foundation, one that stretched from grazing fields to trade routes to market stalls. And as these systems matured, knitting became deeply embedded in broader economic networks. What had begun as local necessity was now tied to regional specialization and long-distance trade. The craft remained quiet. The hands remained steady. But the system beneath them was growing. But it altered what was possible. For the first time, loops could be formed mechanically. Rows could be standardized. Output could increase without relying entirely on individual skill. What had once taken days could now be produced in hours. The impact was immediate and unsettling. On one hand, the stocking frame promised consistency. Garments could be made to uniform sizes. Quality could be controlled more precisely. Production could scale to meet growing demand in expanding cities. On the other hand, it introduced fear. Skilled knitters worried quietly about displacement. If machines could replicate their work, what would happen to the value of skill? To the time invested in mastery? To the livelihoods built stitch by stitch? These concerns were not theoretical. The stocking frame represented a shift in where value was created. Skill began to move from the hands of individual makers into the design and ownership of tools. Control shifted toward those who could afford machines and space to house them. Still, adoption was uneven. Early stocking frames were expensive. They required maintenance. They needed trained operators. As a result, hand knitting did not disappear. It continued alongside mechanized production, often filling gaps machines could not. Custom work, repairs, small runs, local needs. For a time, both systems coexisted, but the direction was clear. Speed was becoming valuable, uniformity was becoming desirable, and technology was beginning to redefine productivity. The stocking frame marked the first major turning point in knitting's economic history, not because it ended the craft, it did not, but because it introduced a new logic, one where output could be separated from human limitation, where time could be compressed, where repetition could be automated. This logic would spread, and as it did, knitting, like many crafts, would be forced to adapt once again. For centuries, knitting changed slowly. Techniques evolved, patterns improved, materials varied, but the fundamental act, hands guiding yarn into fabric, remained the same. That changed in the late 16th century. In 1589, an English clergyman named William Lee developed a machine known as the stocking frame. Its purpose was simple: to produce knitted fabric more quickly and more evenly than human hands alone. The stocking frame did not replace knitting outright, but it altered what was possible. For the first time, loops could be formed mechanically, rows could be standardized, output could increase without relying entirely on individual skill. What had once taken days could now be produced in hours. The impact was immediate and unsettling. On one hand, the stocking frame promised consistency. Garments could be made to uniform sizes. Quality could be controlled more precisely. Production could scale to meet growing demand in expanding cities. On the other hand, it introduced fear. Skilled knitters worried quietly about displacement. If machines could replicate their work, what would happen to the value of skill? To the time invested in mastery? To the livelihoods built stitch by stitch? These concerns were not theoretical. The stocking frame represented a shift in where value was created. Skill began to move from the hands of individual makers into the design and ownership of tools. Control shifted toward those who could afford machines and space to house them. Still, adoption was uneven. Early stocking frames were expensive. They required maintenance. They needed trained operators. As a result, hand knitting did not disappear. It continued alongside mechanized production, often filling gaps machines could not. Custom work, repairs, small runs, local needs. For a time, both systems coexisted, but the direction was clear. Speed was becoming valuable, uniformity was becoming desirable, and technology was beginning to redefine productivity. The stocking frame marked the first major turning point in knitting's economic history, not because it ended the craft, it did not, but because it introduced a new logic, one where output could be separated from human limitation, where time could be compressed, where repetition could be automated. This logic would spread, and as it did, knitting, like many crafts, would be forced to adapt once again. When faced with change, not all resistance is loud. Sometimes it is quiet, persistent, patient. As mechanized knitting expanded, hand knitting did not disappear. Instead, it shifted. It moved into spaces where machines struggled. It adapted to needs that could not be standardized. It continued where flexibility mattered more than speed. Hand knitters focused on fit, on repair, on durability, on individual preference. They made garments that could not be easily replicated by uniform systems, items shaped for specific bodies, clothing designed for particular climates or kinds of work. Pieces adjusted and mended over time rather than replaced. This adaptability was key. Machines excelled at repetition. Hands excelled at variation. Where machines produced volume, hand knitting produced responsiveness. And as long as people needed garments that fit real lives, not ideal measurements, there was space for handwork. Hand knitting also survived because of how it fit into life. It did not require a factory. It did not require schedules imposed from outside. It did not require complete dependence. People knitted in the margins of their days, in evenings, during winter months, between other forms of work. This flexibility allowed knitting to persist even when it was no longer a primary source of income. In many cases, knitting became supplemental rather than central. But supplemental work still matters. It stabilizes households, it smooths uncertainty, it fills gaps left by more volatile forms of labor. There was also cultural memory at work. Techniques were passed down, patterns were preserved. Knowledge moved quietly from one generation to the next. Even when economic incentives weakened, the skill itself endured. And skill, once learned, does not disappear easily. This persistence was not accidental. Hand knitting survived because it remained useful, because it remained accessible, because it could contract and expand without breaking. It required no permission to continue, no institution to approve it, no infrastructure beyond hands and fiber. In this way, hand knitting demonstrated a different kind of resilience, not growth-driven, not efficiency-focused, but durable. It adjusted without abandoning its core. It coexisted with machines rather than competing directly. It found new roles, sometimes smaller, sometimes more meaningful. This pattern would repeat again and again. Each time technology reshaped the economy, hand knitting shifted position rather than vanishing. It retreated when necessary and returned when conditions allowed. And because of that, it remained present, waiting, ready to reemerge when the world once again began to value slowness, attention, and human-scale work. When World War I began, the scale of demand changed overnight. Armies expanded rapidly, supply lines stretched thin, and clothing, especially warm, durable clothing, became a strategic concern. Uniforms could be manufactured, weapons could be produced, but something as simple as warmth proved harder to guarantee. Soldiers spent long periods exposed to cold, damp conditions, trenches flooded, boots wore down, socks, often overlooked, became essential. Poor footwear and inadequate insulation led to illness, infection, and reduced morale. Knitting returned to the center of daily life. Across Europe and North America, citizens were encouraged to knit for the front. Socks, scarves, gloves, and caps were produced at home and sent to soldiers abroad. Governments, charities, and relief organizations organized campaigns to coordinate this effort. Patterns were standardized, materials were distributed, instructions were shared widely. Knitting became both practical and symbolic. Each garment served a function, keeping a soldier warm, reducing injury, extending endurance. But it also carried something less tangible, a sense of care, a reminder of home, a connection to civilian life during long periods of isolation. This mattered. Morale was not abstract. It affected readiness, resilience, and survival. Knowing that someone, somewhere, had spent time making something specifically for you carried weight. For those at home, knitting offered purpose. War created distance and uncertainty. Knitting filled time with action. It allowed people, especially those unable to fight, to contribute in a direct, meaningful way. Hands moved steadily while news arrived slowly. Stitches accumulated while waiting continued. Knitting transformed anxiety into effort. Economically, this mass mobilization was significant. Millions of garments were produced outside of factories, supplementing strained industrial capacity. The domestic sphere once again became a site of production, decentralized, flexible, and responsive. Knitting scaled without machines. It relied on existing skills. It used available time. It adapted to shortages and changing needs. In this moment, knitting demonstrated something essential, that human-scale work could respond quickly in times of crisis, that decentralized production could support large systems, that softness and strength were not opposites. World War I did not invent wartime knitting, but it revealed its power. A quiet craft became a collective effort. A domestic skill became logistical support. And through simple garments, socks, scarves, and caps, knitting once again proved itself indispensable. By the time World War II began, the role of knitting was already understood. What had been improvised during the First War became organized during the Second. Governments recognized the value of domestic production. They understood that factories alone could not meet every need, especially during periods of rationing, labor shortages, and disrupted supply chains. Knitting was formally mobilized. Public campaigns encouraged citizens to knit for soldiers, refugees, and civilian relief efforts. Instructions were distributed widely. Posters and pamphlets framed knitting as both patriotic duty and practical contribution. Standardized patterns were issued. Materials were rationed carefully. Output was tracked and coordinated. Knitting became part of national logistics. Community groups formed to support the effort. Churches, schools, and local organizations hosted knitting drives. People gathered, sometimes physically, sometimes informally, to produce garments together. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They increased output. They shared skills. They maintained morale. In a time of uncertainty and loss, knitting created structure. It gave people something concrete to do, something measurable, repeatable, and useful. Each finished item represented progress. Each bundle sent overseas represented contribution. For many, knitting also offered emotional regulation. Repetitive motion steadied attention. routine softened fear, purpose countered helplessness. Economically, wartime knitting again blurred boundaries. The line between unpaid labor and industrial production became less clear. Domestic work filled gaps that centralized systems could not. Knitting reduced pressure on factories by handling items that were labor-intensive but essential. This distributed model proved effective. It required no new infrastructure. It adapted to changing needs. It scaled through participation rather than capital investment. By the end of the war, millions of garments had been produced through home-front knitting efforts. But the impact extended beyond numbers. People had relearned how to make things, skills were refreshed, communities were reinforced. When the war ended, knitting did not simply vanish. It lingered, embedded alongside its practical role. Knitting carried something less visible: emotion. War creates long stretches of waiting, waiting for news, waiting for letters, waiting for return. In those spaces, knitting offered structure. Each stitch provided movement when progress felt distant. Each row completed was something finished in a time when so much remained uncertain. For those at home, knitting became a way to care across distance. A scarf was not just warmth, it was time given, attention focused, thought held. Hands worked while minds wandered, toward loved ones, toward safety, toward hope. The repetitive motion allowed space for worry without being overwhelmed by it. This mattered, because emotional labor is still labor. It consumes energy, it requires endurance, and it produces something real, even if that output is not easily measured. Knitting transformed emotion into action. Anxiety became effort, fear became rhythm, helplessness became purpose. Communities felt this collectively. Knitting circles became places of quiet solidarity. People sat together without needing to speak constantly. The work itself provided connection. No urgency, no demand, just presence. This shared stillness supported resilience. It allowed people to process events gradually rather than all at once. It created continuity when the outside world felt fragmented. And for those receiving the garments, the effect was just as real. Knowing that someone had taken time, intentionally, to make something for you carried comfort. It was a reminder that you were remembered, that you were held in thought. These intangible effects mattered alongside physical warmth. They sustained morale. They reinforced bonds. They reminded people why endurance mattered. When viewed through this lens, knitting was not merely supplemental to wartime economies. It was integrative. It connected production with care, output with meaning, work with humanity. And this emotional dimension helps explain why knitting persists even when it is no longer economically necessary. Because beyond income and efficiency, knitting has always offered something else: a way to remain connected, a way to contribute, a way to move forward, one stitch at a time. After the wars ended, the world moved quickly. Factories expanded, production accelerated, efficiency became the dominant measure of success. Clothing, once shaped by time and handwork, entered a new phase. Machines grew faster, processes became standardized, garments were produced in enormous quantities. The goal was access. Clothing needed to be affordable, available year-round, consistent in size and appearance. Mass manufacturing made this possible. Cheap clothing became widely accessible for the first time in history. Families no longer needed to rely on handmade garments for daily wear. Stores filled with ready-made options, replacing weeks of labor with a single purchase. At the same time, materials changed. Synthetic fibers were introduced and refined. Acrylics, nylons, and blends offered durability, uniformity, and low cost. These fibers could be produced at scale, unaffected by weather, grazing land, or seasonal variation. From an industrial perspective, this was progress. Supply chains stabilized, prices dropped, production became predictable. But these changes quietly altered the relationship between people and clothing. Garments were no longer repaired as often. Replacement became easier than maintenance. The time embedded in each piece became invisible. Knitting, once central to daily life, began to recede. It was no longer necessary for survival, no longer required for warmth, no longer the most efficient option. Instead, it became optional, a hobby, a pastime, something done for pleasure rather than need. This shift did not erase knitting, but it changed how it was understood. The economic role diminished, the cultural role softened, the skill moved from necessity to tradition. For a time, it seemed as though knitting might quietly fade, preserved only in memory, ritual, or nostalgia. But what mass manufacturing gained in speed, it lost in intimacy. And over time, that absence would be felt. The same forces that made clothing cheaper also made it more distant, from labor, from materials, from meaning. That distance would eventually create space. Space for reflection, space for return, and space for knitting to reemerge, not as necessity, but as choice. As mass manufacturing reshaped daily life, knitting changed roles. What had once been work became something else. With clothing readily available and inexpensive, the economic necessity of knitting faded. Fewer households depended on handmade garments for income or survival. The craft no longer needed to carry the weight it once had. Gradually, knitting was reclassified, not as labor, not as trade, but as a hobby. This shift was subtle but significant. A hobby is something done in spare time, something optional, something separate from productivity. By placing knitting in this category, its economic identity softened. The hours spent knitting were no longer counted as work. The skill was no longer framed as professional. The output was no longer expected to compete with industrial goods. This reframing had consequences. When a practice is labeled a hobby, its value changes. The time invested becomes invisible. The expertise required is underestimated. The economic contribution, if it exists, is often dismissed or overlooked. Knitting still required patience, still required skill, still produced tangible goods, but the surrounding culture no longer recognized it as economically meaningful. For many, knitting continued quietly. It became something passed down within families, something done for comfort, for tradition, or for personal satisfaction. The craft survived in living rooms, in community groups, and in moments carved out from busy lives. Yet something had been lost. Not the technique, not the knowledge, but the recognition. Knitting was no longer seen as a way to support a household, no longer viewed as legitimate work, no longer understood as part of the economic system. This loss of identity mattered, because when work is no longer recognized as work, it becomes easier to dismiss the people who do it. The discipline fades from public awareness, even if it remains practiced privately. Still, knitting endured. It persisted because it offered more than income. It offered rhythm, focus, calm. In a world growing faster and louder, knitting became a place of stillness, a way to slow time rather than compress it. This reframing planted a seed. By removing economic pressure, knitting gained something else: freedom. It could exist without obligation, without deadlines, without markets. And in that quieter space, the craft waited, not gone, not finished, just resting. until conditions changed again. Needles and yarn moved from one generation to the next, along with patterns memorized rather than written. Others found knitting through necessity again, during periods of scarcity, isolation, or change. When money was tight, handmade garments still mattered. When time stretched along, repetitive work still helped fill it. Knitting survived in these margins, in rural communities where industrial supply arrived slowly, in immigrant households where traditions remained intact, in aging populations where skills endured even as industries moved on. It also survived through counterculture. As the modern world accelerated, some people deliberately slowed down. They rejected uniformity. They sought craft, texture, and imperfection. Knitting appealed to those instincts. It offered control in a world that felt increasingly automated. It offered touch in a world growing abstract. It offered patience in a culture that rewarded urgency. Small groups formed, informal gatherings, shared patterns and conversations. These were not markets. They were not movements. They were continuities. Knitting persisted because it was adaptable. It could exist without recognition, without validation, without demand. It did not require permission to continue, only willingness. And in that quiet persistence, something important was preserved. Knowledge, muscle memory, a way of working that valued time rather than speed. When conditions shifted, when people began to question mass production, when they sought meaning in making, when the pace of life felt unsustainable, knitting was still there, ready. The revival that followed would feel sudden to some, but it was not sudden at all. It had been waiting. By the 1970s, the world was beginning to feel the weight of speed. Industrial growth had delivered abundance, but it had also created distance between people and products, between labor and meaning, between consumption and care. In response, a quiet shift began. Some people started looking backward, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. They questioned systems built entirely on efficiency. They wondered what had been lost in the pursuit of scale, and they began to explore alternatives rooted in simplicity, self-sufficiency, and connection to the natural world. Handmade work returned to the conversation. Knitting fit naturally into this movement. It required few tools. It relied on renewable materials. It turned time into something tangible. This was not a rejection of modern life, but a rebalancing. People sought to understand where things came from, how they were made, what they cost beyond money. Knitting became a way to participate in that inquiry. The economics were modest but meaningful. Making something by hand revealed the true cost of labor. Hours spent producing a single garment reframed how value was understood. Cheap clothing no longer felt neutral. It felt distant. The handmade movement emphasized durability over novelty, repair over replacement, use over display. Knitting aligned with these values. It allowed individuals to step outside purely industrial cycles, to produce something locally, to slow consumption by slowing production. This was not yet a widespread return to knitting as income. For most, it remained supplemental, but its meaning had shifted. Knitting was no longer only tradition, it was choice, and that choice carried economic implications. People who knitted began to see their time differently. They recognized effort. They understood why handmade goods cost more. They began to support small producers, even when mass-produced alternatives were cheaper. In this way, the 1970s handmade movement planted the groundwork for something larger. A renewed respect for craft, a reconsideration of scale, and a quiet re-entry of knitting into the economic conversation, not as necessity, but as values-driven work. As interest in handmade work grew, the infrastructure around knitting began to change. Mass retailers still dominated clothing sales. Craft supplies were available, but often limited. Generic materials, few options, little guidance. In response, a new kind of business quietly emerged: specialty yarn shops. These were small, focused retail spaces built around a single idea: that materials mattered. Fiber type, texture, source, and color were no longer interchangeable. They were choices, meaningful ones. Unlike large stores, these shops did not compete on volume. They competed on knowledge. Owners understood yarn. They could explain differences between fibers, weights, and techniques. They curated inventory rather than stocking everything. Their shelves reflected intention rather than scale. This was a different retail model. Instead of serving anonymous consumers, specialty yarn shops served communities. Customers returned not just to buy materials, but to ask questions, share progress, and learn. Classes were offered, patterns were recommended, conversations happened slowly. Economically, these shops occupied a narrow but durable space. They sold fewer items, but at higher margins. They relied on repeat customers rather than foot traffic. Their value proposition was not price, it was trust. This model worked because it aligned with the craft itself. Knitting required patience. Yarn selection required care. The buying experience mirrored the making process. Specialty yarn shops also supported upstream producers. Small mills and independent dyers gained access to customers who cared about origin and quality. This created localized supply chains, smaller, slower, but more resilient. Over time, these shops became more than retailers. They became anchors, places where knowledge circulated, where beginners felt welcome, where experienced knitters stayed connected. In an economy increasingly defined by scale and speed, specialty yarn shops proved that small, focused businesses could still thrive by offering depth instead of breadth. And in doing so, they helped knit the revival together. As knitting returned to everyday life, it carried something new: not necessity, not obligation, but choice. And with choice came expression. Knitting was no longer limited to what was required for warmth or durability. It became a way to say something about taste, values, and attention. Color mattered, pattern mattered, texture mattered. A garment could reflect personality rather than function alone. It could be playful or restrained, traditional or experimental, quiet or bold. This shift changed how knitting was understood. It was no longer only about producing an object. It was about shaping identity. People chose yarns that aligned with how they wanted to live: natural fibers for those drawn to simplicity, bright colors for those seeking joy, hand-dyed skeins for those who valued uniqueness. Time spent knitting became intentional. Hours were invested not because they were required, but because they were meaningful. The process itself became part of the value, not something to be minimized, but something to be experienced. This reframing had economic implications. When knitting became expression, handmade goods were no longer compared directly to mass-produced clothing. They occupied a different category. Their value was not measured only in utility, but in meaning. People were willing to pay more or to spend more time because the outcome felt personal. Knitting also allowed individuals to step outside standardized fashion cycles. They could create garments that fit their bodies, climates, and preferences rather than conforming to trends. In this way, knitting offered autonomy. not just over production, but over appearance, not just over output, but over representation. This sense of identity extended beyond individuals. Communities formed around shared aesthetics. Certain styles signaled belonging. Patterns carried cultural references. Techniques reflected lineage and place. Knitting became a language, quiet, visual, understood by those who practiced it. And through that language, the craft continued to evolve, no longer defined solely by necessity, no longer confined to the margins. Knitting had become something else entirely, not just useful, but expressive. As the pace of modern life accelerated, something unexpected happened. People began to seek the opposite, not more stimulation, not more efficiency, but comfort. The idea of cozy entered the cultural conversation, not as decoration, but as a response, a way to soften environments, routines, and expectations. In some places, this idea already had a name, hygge, a word associated with warmth, ease, and shared quiet, time spent without urgency, spaces designed for calm rather than display. Attention turned inward rather than outward. But the feeling was not limited to one culture. Across many societies, people began to slow down deliberately. They questioned constant productivity. They reconsidered what a good life felt like, not just what it achieved. This shift became known as slow living. It emphasized presence over pace, process over outcome, care over convenience. Knitting fit naturally into this mindset. It asked for time, it rewarded patience, it offered rhythm without pressure. The repetitive motion steadied attention. The gradual progress made effort visible. The result was not instant, but it was real. As people embraced slower ways of living, knitting became more than a craft. It became an atmosphere, a way to structure time gently, a way to create moments of rest within busy lives, a way to participate in something that did not demand constant engagement. This atmosphere carried economic weight. Cozy began to describe not just feelings, but products. Homes, clothing, and routines were shaped around comfort and softness. Industries formed around this desire. Textiles, decor, handmade goods, and experiences designed to calm rather than excite. Knitting sat at the center of this shift. It embodied the values people were seeking. It made slowness visible. It turned calm into something tangible. What once existed quietly now had language. And once something has language, it can be shared, supported, and sustained. The rise of cozy was not a trend in the usual sense. It was a correction, a return to warmth in a world that had grown too sharp. As the desire for comfort grew, it began to shape markets, not suddenly, not aggressively, but steadily. What people sought emotionally, warmth, calm, familiarity, began to appear in what they bought. Home decor shifted first. Soft textures replaced sharp lines. Natural materials replaced synthetic shine. Blankets, cushions, handmade objects, and muted colors became more common. Spaces were designed to feel lived in rather than optimized. Knitting aligned naturally with this change. A knitted throw carried more than warmth. It suggested care, time, presence. In fashion, a similar shift occurred. Clothing moved away from rigid formality and toward comfort. Sweaters, scarves, and layered garments became everyday wear. Fit mattered, but ease mattered more. Handmade and hand-inspired aesthetics gained value. Knitted garments signaled something subtle, not luxury in the traditional sense, but intention. They suggested that the wearer valued comfort over display, process over speed. This created space for smaller producers. Independent knitwear brands emerged, Makers sold directly to customers. Limited runs replaced mass inventory. Stories about materials and process became part of the product itself. Lifestyle branding followed. Cozy became more than a description. It became an identity. Brands formed around feelings rather than functions. They sold not just objects, but environments, ways of living slowly within a fast world. Knitting appeared in these narratives again and again. It represented patience. It represented care. It represented human scale. Importantly, monetizing comfort did not require scale. It required trust. Customers were willing to pay more for items that felt personal. They valued goods that carried evidence of time and attention. They supported brands that aligned with how they wanted to feel, not just what they wanted to own. This changed how value was measured. Efficiency mattered less. Story mattered more. Connection became currency. Knitting fit this economy precisely. It could not be rushed without losing meaning. It could not be standardized without losing character. Its value increased with visibility into the process. What once existed quietly in private spaces now entered the market openly, not as necessity, but as comfort made tangible. And in doing so, knitting helped define a new kind of business, one built on calm rather than urgency, on trust rather than volume, on warmth rather than speed. Softness sells because it answers a need that is rarely named. In a world shaped by speed, noise, and constant evaluation, people become tired, not just physically, but cognitively. Attention is pulled in many directions. Decisions accumulate. The nervous system remains active long after the day has ended. Softness offers relief, not as escape, but as regulation. Objects that feel gentle invite the body to relax. Textures that require care slow movement. Processes that unfold gradually reduce pressure. These effects are subtle, but they are real. Economists often focus on price, utility, and efficiency. But human behavior is also shaped by emotion, memory, and comfort. People do not buy only what they need. They buy what helps them feel steady. Knitted objects carry emotional signals. They suggest warmth before they are touched. They imply time before they are worn. They communicate care without explanation. This is emotional economics at work. The value of softness is not located only in the object itself. It lives in anticipation, association, and experience. A knitted garment is not just clothing. It is a reminder of patience, a pause in the rhythm of consumption. This kind of value is durable. It does not depend on trends. It does not require constant novelty. It deepens over time rather than fading. When people invest in softness, they are often investing in how they want to feel, calmer, safer, more grounded. That feeling extends beyond the object into daily life. This explains why softness continues to generate economic value even when cheaper alternatives exist. Mass-produced items may satisfy function, but softness satisfies something else. It creates a sense of care in environments that feel impersonal. It restores a feeling of control in systems that feel overwhelming. It allows people to slow down without stepping away entirely. Knitting embodies this exchange perfectly. The labor is visible. The pace is legible. The outcome feels earned rather than extracted. Softness sells because it reassures. It signals that not everything must be rushed. That effort can be gentle. That value does not always need to be loud. In this way, knitting is not just aligned with the cozy economy, it helps explain it. Why people return to handmade goods, why they support small producers, why they are willing to trade speed for care. Softness sells because it meets people where they are. And in a restless world, that is a powerful thing. Before a single stitch is made, knitting begins far from needles and yarn. It begins in fields. Sheep farming sits at the foundation of the knitting economy. Long before yarn reaches a shelf or a basket, it exists as fiber grown slowly over time. Wool develops season by season, shaped by climate, land, and care. This is patient production. Sheep are raised, sheared, and tended over years. The quality of the wool reflects these conditions: the health of the animal, the environment it lives in, the timing of the shear. Fiber length, softness, and strength all begin here. From farms, wool moves to mills. Milling is where raw fleece becomes usable material. It is cleaned, sorted, and spun into yarn. This process removes debris, aligns fibers, and transforms something irregular into something consistent. Mills vary widely. Some are small and local, serving nearby farms and producers. Others are large and industrial, processing enormous volumes with precision. Each approach carries trade-offs: scale versus flexibility, efficiency versus character. The decisions made at this stage affect everything that follows: how tightly yarn is spun, how durable it will be, how it feels in the hand. After spinning comes dyeing. Color adds identity. Some yarn remains natural, preserving the shades created by the animal itself. Others are dyed, sometimes in large batches, sometimes by hand. Dyeing introduces another layer of choice and variation. Hand-dyed yarns often carry subtle differences from skein to skein. No two batches are exactly the same. This variability becomes part of the appeal, evidence of process rather than flaw. Industrial dyeing prioritizes consistency. Colors are replicated precisely, batches are controlled, and variation is minimized. This supports scale and predictability. Both approaches serve different needs. Together, farming, milling, and dyeing form a quiet chain. Each step depends on the one before it. Each introduces constraints and possibilities. By the time yarn reaches a knitter's hands, it already contains layers of labor, decision-making, and time. Knitting may appear simple on the surface, but behind every skein is a long sequence of work spread across people, places, and processes, moving slowly, deliberately, and largely unseen. When people encounter yarn for the first time, one question often arises: why does it cost so much or so little? Two skeins can look similar at a glance, yet one costs a few dollars while another costs many times more. The difference is not arbitrary. It reflects layers of choice, labor, and scale. Materials are the first factor. Not all fibers are equal. Some yarns are made from synthetic materials designed for consistency and low cost. Others come from natural fibers: wool, alpaca, silk, each with different growing conditions, yields, and limitations. Natural fibers take time. Animals must be raised, cared for, and sheared. Weather affects supply. Land limits scale. These constraints shape availability and price long before yarn is spun. Labor is the second factor. Hand processes take longer. Small mills operate at human speed. Independent dyers work in batches. Quality is monitored by touch rather than automation. Each step requires attention, and attention costs time. When labor is visible, price rises. Not because of luxury, but because hours accumulate. The cost reflects the time embedded in the material, not just the object itself. Scale is the third factor. Large manufacturers benefit from volume. They purchase materials in bulk, automate processes, and distribute widely. Costs are spread across thousands, sometimes millions, of units. Small producers do not have this advantage. They operate with limited equipment, limited output, and narrower margins. What they offer instead is flexibility, uniqueness, and responsiveness. Neither approach is inherently better. They serve different purposes. Lower-priced yarns support accessibility. They allow beginners to practice. They keep the craft open. Higher-priced yarns support sustainability, local production, and creative experimentation. Understanding this variation reframes the question. Yarn prices do not reflect only fiber. They reflect systems, how materials are sourced, how labor is valued, how production is scaled. In this way, a skein of yarn becomes a small economic map, one that shows where time, effort, and care have been concentrated. And once you notice that, the differences begin to make sense. By this point, a pattern becomes visible. The knitting economy operates in two parallel systems, one industrial, one independent. The industrial system prioritizes scale. Large producers focus on consistency, volume, and price. Materials are standardized. Processes are automated. Output is predictable. These systems make knitting accessible to many by keeping costs low and supply steady. Industrial yarns are designed to perform reliably. They behave the same from batch to batch. They are available year-round. They fit easily into global distribution networks. The system values efficiency. Alongside it, an independent system exists. Indie producers work at smaller scales. They focus on character rather than uniformity. Variation is expected. Differences between batches are accepted, even appreciated. Independent mills and dyers often work closer to the source. Relationships matter. Knowledge is embedded in practice rather than documentation. Output is limited by time, not demand. This system values attention. The two economies serve different needs. Industrial production supports learning, experimentation, and accessibility. It keeps the craft open to newcomers. Independent production supports depth, sustainability, and creative expression. They do not cancel each other out. They coexist. Knitting thrives because it can move between these systems. A beginner might start with industrial yarn, then later choose indie materials. A project might combine both, one for structure, the other for character. This flexibility is part of knitting's resilience. It does not rely on a single economic model. It adapts to what is available. It welcomes different levels of commitment and investment. Importantly, both systems depend on trust. Industrial producers must maintain consistency. Independent producers must maintain integrity. In each case, reliability sustains the relationship between maker and material. By holding space for both, knitting avoids extremes. It is not locked into mass production. It is not confined to exclusivity. Instead, it operates across a spectrum, one that allows the craft to remain both accessible and meaningful. This balance helps explain why knitting continues to endure, because it does not require a single way of working, only a willingness to engage. As knitting moved further into the modern world, something interesting happened at the point of sale. Retail became personal again. Local yarn shops were not designed to move people through quickly. They were designed to invite people in and give them a reason to stay. Classes became a natural extension of the business. Beginners learned how to cast on. Experienced knitters refined techniques. Knowledge moved person to person, not screen to screen. These classes were not just instruction, they were entry points. They lowered barriers. They built confidence. They turned curiosity into participation. From a business perspective, this mattered. A customer who learns in a space is more likely to return to it. Materials purchased there carry memory and familiarity. The shop becomes part of the making process rather than just a supplier. Gatherings followed. Knitting circles formed organically, weekly, monthly, sometimes simply when chairs were available. People brought projects and sat together, working quietly or talking gently as stitches accumulated. No agenda, no rush, no pressure to produce. These gatherings created something rare in retail: time. People lingered, relationships formed, trust deepened. The shop became more than a place to buy yarn. It became a place to belong. This sense of belonging was not accidental. Local yarn shops succeeded not by maximizing transactions, but by deepening connection. Their value was not measured only in sales per square foot, but in repeat visits, word of mouth, and loyalty built slowly. In a retail landscape increasingly optimized for speed and scale, this approach stood apart. It relied on presence rather than promotion, on care rather than conversion, on shared experience rather than volume. Retail with a soul does not look efficient on paper, but it endures because people return to places where they feel seen, where learning is welcomed, where time is respected. And in these quiet rooms, filled with yarn, conversation, and patience, knitting continued to function not just as a craft, but as a living economy. Soft pause, transition into 10.2. Sociologists sometimes use the term third place to describe spaces that exist outside of home and work. Places where people gather without obligation, where no one is required to perform, where time is allowed to unfold gently. Local yarn shops often become these places. They offer something increasingly rare: unstructured social connection. People arrive with projects, but they stay for the presence. Conversation flows naturally, and silence is equally welcome. This balance matters. In many modern environments, social interaction is either transactional or curated. There are expectations to buy, to impress, to keep up. Third places reduce that pressure. Knitting helps. The act itself provides focus without isolation. Hands stay busy. Attention is occupied just enough to make conversation easier or unnecessary. People can sit together without needing to fill the space with words. This has subtle effects on mental health. Repetitive motion steadies the nervous system. Shared quiet reduces loneliness. Routine creates predictability. For many, these spaces offer relief from constant stimulation. They provide a reason to leave the house without pressure to achieve anything. Simply showing up is enough. Local yarn shops often recognize this role intuitively. They provide chairs, they allow time, they do not rush people out. From a business perspective, this generosity is intentional. A shop that supports well-being builds trust. Customers associate the space with calm rather than urgency. Over time, that association becomes loyalty. People return not just for supplies, but for how the space makes them feel. This is not accidental. Human connection has economic value. It sustains small businesses by creating relationships that extend beyond price comparison. It turns retail into continuity rather than transaction. In a broader sense, these third places help knit communities together. They reduce isolation. They support routine. They offer gentle structure in lives that may otherwise feel fragmented. And in doing so, they reinforce the quiet truth at the center of this story. That knitting has always been about more than objects, more than output, more than economy. It has always been about connection. Large retailers changed the landscape. Big box craft stores offered convenience. Online platforms offered speed. Selection expanded, prices dropped. From the outside, it might have seemed inevitable that small specialty shops would disappear. But many did not. They adapted. Large retailers like Michael's, along with online marketplaces, excel at scale. They offer wide inventory, standardized products, and efficiency. For many customers, this accessibility is valuable. It lowers barriers and keeps the craft open. Local yarn shops did not try to compete on those terms. They chose differentiation instead. Where big stores optimized for volume, small shops optimized for relationship. They focused on depth rather than breadth, on guidance rather than abundance. Community became their advantage. A local shop knows its customers. It remembers projects, preferences, and progress. It offers recommendations based on experience rather than algorithms. When a knitter runs into a problem, they can ask a person, not search endlessly. When a project stalls, encouragement is immediate. This support cannot be replicated easily at scale. Online retailers provide convenience. Local shops provide continuity. Big box stores move people through. Local shops invite people to stay. This difference shapes loyalty. Customers who feel known return. They value expertise. They support spaces that have supported them, even when cheaper options exist. From a business perspective, this is a different metric of success. Survival is not measured by market dominance. It is measured by relevance. Local yarn shops remain relevant by offering something essential that large systems cannot: human presence, shared time, and a sense of belonging. They do not replace big retailers. They coexist with them. Each serves a purpose. But in an economy increasingly driven by speed and automation, the spaces that endure are often the ones that slow things down. By centering community rather than competition, local yarn shops continue to hold their place, not because they are the biggest, but because they are meaningful. And in that meaning, they find sustainability. As the internet matured, knitting found a new place to live. Not in factories, not in stores, but on screens. Platforms like YouTube became unexpected classrooms. People who had learned knitting through family, neighbors, or local shops began sharing that knowledge more widely. One camera, one project, one calm explanation at a time. This was not fast content. Knitting tutorials moved slowly. Instructions were repeated. Mistakes were shown, not edited out. In many ways, the medium matched the craft. Videos paused where hands paused. Progress unfolded gradually. Attention was invited, not demanded. What changed was reach. A technique once passed between two people could now reach thousands. Patterns that might have stayed regional became global. Knowledge crossed borders without losing its personal tone. This shift transformed knowledge itself into content. Not content designed to provoke, but content designed to teach. Creators built libraries of instruction, casting on, fixing mistakes, finishing garments. Over time, viewers returned not just for answers, but for familiarity. Voices became trusted, styles became recognizable. This trust mattered, because when knowledge is shared calmly and consistently, it carries authority without force. Viewers felt guided rather than sold to. Economically, this created a new layer in the knitting ecosystem. Tutorial creators generated income through ads, sponsorships, and audience support. Their value came not from owning materials, but from understanding them deeply. Skill became monetizable again, not through production of goods, but through explanation. This mirrored earlier patterns. Just as experienced knitters once taught apprentices, modern creators taught audiences. The medium changed. The relationship remained. Importantly, YouTube lowered barriers. Anyone with patience and clarity could contribute. Expertise was demonstrated over time rather than certified. Knowledge was evaluated by usefulness rather than credentials. This democratization reshaped the craft. Learning no longer depended on location. Access expanded. New knitters entered the practice from places where local instruction might not exist. And yet, the tone remained familiar, quiet, repetitive, steady. Knitting did not speed up to fit the internet. The internet slowed down to fit knitting. And in doing so, a centuries-old craft found new ways to teach and new ways to sustain itself. As knitting knowledge moved online, something else followed. Design. Patterns that had once been shared informally through books, magazines, or handwritten notes began to take digital form. Simple files, clear instructions, easily shared. The PDF became a turning point. With it, pattern designers no longer needed publishers, printers, or physical distribution. A single file could be created once, then sold repeatedly without inventory, storage, or shipping. This changed the economics of design. Pattern designers became digital entrepreneurs. They invested time up front, testing patterns, refining instructions, correcting errors. That labor was concentrated early, but once complete, the pattern could continue generating income over time. This is often described as passive income, but the term can be misleading. The income may arrive without daily production, but the work behind it is not passive. Design requires expertise, clarity, responsibility. Patterns must be accurate, readable, and reliable. Trust matters. A well-written pattern saves time. It prevents frustration. It guides hands smoothly from start to finish. When it works, knitters return to that designer again. Reputation becomes currency. Designers develop recognizable styles. Certain voices feel calm. Certain instructions feel intuitive. Over time, collections form. Audiences grow. This mirrors earlier systems. Just as knitters once earned trust at markets through consistent quality, designers now earn it digitally. The medium has changed. The principle has not. Economically, this model is efficient. One person can reach many. One design can support long-term work. Small audiences can still sustain creators. This allows designers to remain independent. They can work from home, set their own pace, release patterns slowly rather than chasing volume. For many, pattern design becomes supplemental income. For others, it becomes primary work. In both cases, it restores something knitting had lost during mass manufacturing. Recognition of intellectual labor. The pattern itself becomes the product. The thinking, testing, and experience embedded in it are what people pay for. In this way, knitting once again supports self-directed work, not through factories, not through scale, but through clarity, patience, and trust. And quietly, without fanfare, a centuries-old craft adapts once more, fitting itself into a digital economy without losing its human shape. As knitting moved further into the digital world, it needed places to gather, not physical locations, but shared spaces. Platforms like Ravelry emerged to meet this need. Ravelry is not a store in the traditional sense. It does not hold inventory. It does not ship goods. There are no aisles, no warehouses, no shelves to restock. Instead, it organizes information, patterns, projects, designers, discussions. It functions as a marketplace without physical weight. This structure is significant. By removing storage and distribution, platforms like Ravelry lower the cost of participation. Designers can sell patterns directly. Knitters can discover work easily. knowledge circulates without friction. Value is created through connection rather than possession. A pattern exists as data. A purchase unlocks access, not an object. The cost reflects expertise and clarity rather than material. This model scales quietly. As more users join, the platform becomes more useful. Patterns are reviewed, errors are discussed, improvements are shared. Collective attention refines quality over time. Trust emerges from visibility. Designers are evaluated through their work. Knitters share progress openly. Information accumulates rather than disappears. This openness supports learning. It also supports commerce. Designers reach global audiences. Small-scale work finds sustainable markets. Independent creators are not required to negotiate with large retailers or publishers. For knitters, the experience remains familiar. They browse, they plan, they imagine projects. The difference is that this browsing happens without physical clutter, without excess production, without waste. Platforms like Ravelry demonstrate a different kind of marketplace, one where value flows through knowledge, where scale is achieved through sharing rather than manufacturing, where community and commerce exist in the same space. In this environment, knitting continues its long pattern, adapting to new tools, preserving old rhythms, finding ways to remain human, even as systems change. There is a reason knitting feels calming. It is not accidental, and it is not imagined. Repetition changes the brain. When the same motion is performed again and again, without urgency, without risk, the nervous system begins to settle. Heart rate slows, breathing becomes more regular, muscle tension softens. This is where knitting lives. The movements are predictable, the rhythm is steady. Attention is required, but only lightly. Neuroscientists refer to this state as flow. Flow occurs when a task is engaging enough to hold attention, but not so demanding that it creates stress. The mind becomes absorbed without strain. Time feels different, either slower or gently suspended. During flow, brain chemistry shifts. Levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, tend to decrease. Neurotransmitters associated with focus and satisfaction, such as dopamine, are released in balanced amounts. The brain moves out of high alert mode and into regulation. This balance matters. Too little stimulation leads to restlessness. Too much leads to anxiety. Knitting sits comfortably in between. The hands remain active, and the mind has something to follow. But there is no pressure to perform. This makes knitting especially effective for unwinding after long periods of mental effort. It allows attention to narrow gently rather than scattering. Thoughts slow down not because they are forced to stop, but because they are no longer competing for dominance. Over time, this pattern trains the brain. Regular engagement in repetitive, low-stakes activity teaches the nervous system how to return to baseline. It creates familiarity with calm. The body learns that not all focus requires tension. This is why many people find knitting helpful before sleep. The transition from wakefulness to rest is often disrupted by lingering alertness. Knitting bridges that gap. It provides movement while allowing vigilance to fade. In this way, knitting is not just relaxing, it is regulating. A quiet collaboration between hands and brain, a steady rhythm that invites the body to follow. And as this rhythm repeats, something subtle happens. The mind lets go, one stitch at a time. As modern life has grown more demanding, calm has become scarce. Attention is pulled constantly. Notifications interrupt, decisions accumulate. For many people, the nervous system rarely returns fully to rest. This creates a quiet imbalance. Stress is not always felt as panic. Often it appears as restlessness, difficulty focusing, trouble settling into sleep, a sense of being mentally occupied even during moments meant for rest. Knitting interrupts this cycle, not dramatically, not forcefully, but consistently. The repetitive motion redirects attention away from abstract concerns and towards something tangible. The hands provide a focal point. The mind follows, gradually releasing its grip on unfinished thoughts. This reduction in mental noise is meaningful. When stress decreases, focus improves. When focus improves, effort feels lighter. Tasks that once felt overwhelming become manageable again. People recognize this effect intuitively. They notice that after knitting, they feel steadier, more present, less rushed. The calm lingers beyond the activity itself. This is where economics enters the picture. In a world where stress is widespread, experiences that reduce it become valuable. People are willing to invest time, money, and attention into practices that help them feel regulated. They pay for yoga classes. They subscribe to meditation apps. They seek environments designed to be soothing. Knitting offers something similar, but with a difference. It produces an object. The calm generated during knitting is not fleeting. It is accompanied by progress, by evidence of time well spent. A finished piece carries the memory of ease embedded in its making. This dual benefit increases perceived value. People are not paying only for materials. They are paying for experience, for focus, for relief. This explains why knitting supplies, classes, and communities continue to attract support even when cheaper alternatives exist. The value is not located solely in the product. It lives in the process. Calm becomes something that can be practiced, revisited, and shared. Focus becomes something that can be rebuilt gently rather than forced. In economic terms, knitting converts attention into well-being. It turns time into regulation, effort into ease. And in an environment where calm is increasingly rare, that conversion holds real worth. As people age, the brain changes, memory retrieval can slow, attention can drift more easily, new information may take longer to settle. These changes are natural, but how the brain is used still matters. Engaging in skilled, repetitive activities, like knitting, has been associated with healthier cognitive aging. Not because it prevents change entirely, but because it keeps multiple systems gently active at once. Knitting asks the brain to coordinate. Patterns are followed, steps are remembered, hands and eyes work together. This combination engages attention, sequencing, and motor planning, all without pressure. Mistakes are correctable. Progress is gradual. There is no penalty for moving slowly. This matters for memory. When tasks are meaningful but low stress, the brain is more likely to remain engaged. Learning continues, even if the pace changes. Familiar movements reinforce neural pathways. New patterns introduce novelty without overload. Knitting also supports orientation in time. Projects unfold over days or weeks. Progress is visible. This sense of continuity can be grounding, especially when days begin to blur together. For many older adults, knitting provides routine without rigidity. It offers purpose without demand. It creates structure that can be returned to easily after interruption. There is also an emotional component. Feeling capable supports cognitive health. Completing a project reinforces confidence. Sharing work creates connection. These experiences reduce isolation, which itself is a risk factor for cognitive decline. Knitting does not claim to cure or prevent disease. It does something quieter. It keeps the mind involved, the hands practiced, the attention gently exercised, and because it is enjoyable, it is sustainable. People return to it not because they are told to, but because it feels good to continue. In this way, knitting supports the brain across a lifetime, not through intensity, not through challenge alone, but through steadiness, a familiar rhythm, a remembered motion, a practice that adapts as the body and mind change. Craft becomes care, and over time, that care accumulates, one stitch, one moment, one calm return to focus at a time. As knitting moved back into focus, the broader clothing industry continued in a different direction. Speed increased, volumes grew, costs fell. Fast fashion reshaped how clothing was produced, sold, and replaced. Garments were designed to move quickly from concept to store. Trends turned over rapidly. Production cycles shortened. From a business perspective, this model was efficient. Large quantities could be produced at low cost. Supply chains were optimized for speed. Consumers gained access to frequent variety. Price became the primary signal of value. Clothing was no longer expected to last. It was expected to arrive quickly, look current, and be replaced just as fast. The cost of individual items dropped while the volume of consumption increased. This model relied on scale. Factories produced thousands of identical pieces. Labor was divided and specialized. Materials were chosen for efficiency rather than longevity. Each step was designed to reduce time and expense. Speed shaped everything. Design decisions favored what could be produced quickly. Quality was balanced against turnover. Durability became secondary to availability. For consumers, this created convenience. For producers, it created pressure. Margins depended on volume. Deadlines tightened. Flexibility narrowed. In this environment, the value of time changed. Hours of labor became compressed. Processes were optimized to remove pauses. Attention shifted away from individual pieces and toward throughput. Fast fashion did not emerge by accident. It responded to demand for affordability and variety. It solved specific problems at scale, but in doing so, it also altered expectations about how long clothing should last, how often it should be replaced, and what it should cost. This shift created a contrast, not between good and bad, but between different economic logics, one built on speed, volume, and cost, another built on patience, repetition, and care. Understanding this contrast helps explain why knitting, slow, deliberate, and human scale, feels distinct in the modern landscape, and why the two systems now exist side by side. In an economy shaped by speed, slowness becomes noticeable, not because it is inefficient, but because it is rare. Time, once abundant, has become fragmented. Tasks overlap. Attention is divided. Moments are measured in notifications and deadlines rather than duration. Against this backdrop, slowness takes on new meaning. It becomes a luxury, not in the sense of excess, but in the sense of choice. To work slowly is to decide not to rush. To make something by hand is to accept the passage of time rather than compress it. Knitting embodies this decision. A garment cannot be hurried without consequence. Each stitch depends on the one before it. Progress is visible and incremental. The maker is present for the entire process. This presence has value. Time spent knitting is not idle. It is engaged, focused, steady. In fast fashion, time is hidden. In knitting, time is revealed. This difference changes perception. A handmade garment carries hours within it. When worn, those hours are remembered. When gifted, they are felt. The value is not only in the object, but in the commitment it represents. As speed becomes the norm, slowness becomes meaningful. People begin to notice how they spend their attention. They seek experiences that allow them to slow down without stepping away from productivity entirely. Knitting offers this balance. It creates output while reducing pressure. It allows work to unfold without urgency. It rewards patience rather than haste. From an economic perspective, this revaluation of time explains renewed interest in handmade goods. People are not simply buying clothing, they are buying time, embedded, visible, and respected. Slowness, once associated with inefficiency, becomes a signal of care. And in a culture that rarely pauses, that signal carries weight. When people talk about sustainability, the conversation often turns technical. Materials, emissions, waste, these factors matter. But sustainability is not only about what is used, it is also about how long something is kept and why. Fast production creates fast disposal. When items are inexpensive and easily replaced, they are rarely repaired. Emotional attachment is minimal. The relationship between user and object remains brief. Knitting operates differently. A handmade garment carries memory of choosing materials, of time spent, of progress made slowly. Because of this, knitted items tend to stay longer. They are worn carefully, repaired when damaged, stored thoughtfully when not in use. This is emotional durability. An object that holds meaning is less likely to be discarded. The environmental impact is reduced not only through materials, but through longevity. Fewer replacements are needed. Fewer resources are consumed over time. From this perspective, sustainability is not only a production issue, it is a relationship issue. Knitting encourages awareness. Makers understand where materials come from. They feel the effort required to create something. This awareness changes behavior, not through rules, but through experience. People who knit often consume differently. They buy less. They choose carefully. They value quality over quantity. This does not require perfection. It requires attention. Sustainability, in this sense, is quiet. It is not performative. It is not driven by urgency. It unfolds over time. Knitting supports this approach naturally. It aligns making with meaning. It connects effort with outcome. It allows value to deepen rather than expire. In a world facing environmental strain, this kind of durability matters, not because it solves everything, but because it changes how people relate to what they own. And sometimes that change is where lasting impact begins. Knitting has always traveled. Patterns moved by word of mouth. Techniques crossed regions through trade. Styles shifted as people carried knowledge with them. What changed in the modern era was speed and reach. Online communities removed geographic limits. A knitter in one country could learn from another thousands of miles away. Shared spaces formed without the need for physical proximity. Forums, social platforms, and digital groups became meeting places. Not loud, not rushed, but persistent. People shared projects, asked questions, offered advice. Progress was documented. Mistakes were normalized. Learning happened in public, but without pressure. These online communities extended what knitting had always provided: connection, continuity, shared understanding. The difference was scale. A technique once taught to a handful of people could now support thousands. Cultural styles mixed gently. Regional traditions became visible rather than isolated. This openness strengthened the craft. It preserved knowledge that might otherwise fade. It allowed innovation to emerge organically. It welcomed new participants regardless of location. Economically, this borderless structure mattered. Creators found audiences beyond local markets. Small producers reached global customers. Patterns and materials circulated without physical relocation. The craft remained rooted in place, but not confined by it. And importantly, the tone remained familiar. Even online, knitting communities valued patience. Questions were answered thoughtfully. Progress was measured in weeks rather than clicks. In a digital environment often shaped by urgency, knitting carried its own pace with it. A craft without borders, but not without rhythm. As knitting entered fully into the digital age, new tools appeared, not to replace the craft, but to support it. Design software allowed patterns to be tested virtually before a single stitch was made. Errors could be identified early. Sizing could be adjusted. Complex structures could be visualized more clearly. These tools reduced friction. They saved time. They lowered barriers. They made experimentation safer. More recently, artificial intelligence has begun to appear at the edges of the craft. AI-assisted pattern generation can suggest stitch combinations, calculate sizing adjustments, or explore variations more quickly than manual methods alone. For designers, this becomes a starting point rather than an endpoint. Ideas are proposed, humans decide. The role of judgment remains unchanged. Knitting still depends on touch, on feel, on how yarn behaves in the hand. No algorithm can fully anticipate how a fiber will drape, stretch, or soften with use. Those decisions still belong to the maker. In this way, technology functions as a collaborator rather than a replacement. Digital tools handle calculation. Humans handle meaning. This balance mirrors earlier adaptations. Just as knitting once absorbed machines without losing its identity, it now absorbs software without losing its rhythm. The craft remains centered on patience and attention, even as tools become more sophisticated. For knitters, these technologies expand possibility without increasing pressure. Patterns can be customized. Mistakes can be corrected more easily. Learning becomes more accessible. Tradition is not erased, it is extended. Old techniques continue to matter. Hand movements remain essential. Knowledge is still passed person to person, even if the medium has changed. Technology meets tradition quietly. And knitting, as it always has, adapts, without rushing, without resistance, and without losing what makes it human. Knitting does not surge. It does not spike. It does not demand attention. It grows quietly. Interest increases slowly, often during periods of uncertainty. Participation deepens rather than explodes. People arrive, learn, and stay, not because of trends, but because the practice fits into their lives. Demand follows the same pattern. It is steady, predictable, resilient. Yarn sales rise gradually. Digital patterns continue to circulate. Communities expand without losing coherence. The craft does not rely on constant novelty to sustain itself. This steadiness is a strength. Businesses built around knitting tend to grow slowly but last. They adjust to conditions without collapsing. They survive downturns because their costs are controlled and their audiences are loyal. There is no rush. Producers do not need to chase attention. Creators do not need to scale endlessly. Participants do not need to keep up. Knitting fits into margins, evenings, weekends, quiet hours. It remains available without demanding dominance. In economic terms, this creates durability. The craft persists because it does not overextend. It remains relevant by staying human-sized. It does not need hype to validate it. Growth occurs because people keep returning, because the practice offers something that does not expire, because it adapts without erasing itself, because it meets real needs for calm, connection, and meaning. Knitting does not promise transformation. It offers continuity. And over time, that continuity adds up. When we step back from the history, the markets, the tools and platforms, something simple remains. Knitting teaches patience, not the kind that waits passively, but the kind that continues steadily, without urgency. In knitting, progress cannot be rushed. Each stitch depends on the one before it. Mistakes are corrected slowly. Time is not compressed, it is accepted. Business often resists this idea. Growth is expected to accelerate. Efficiency is rewarded. Speed is celebrated. And yet the systems that endure tend to share a different quality. They move at a human pace. Knitting teaches value, not as price, but as accumulation. Value builds through repetition, through care, through consistency over time. A finished garment carries hours within it. That time is not hidden. It is visible in the fabric, felt in the weight, remembered in the making. This kind of value is difficult to scale quickly, but it is difficult to replace. In business, value created slowly tends to last longer. Relationships deepen, trust compounds, reputation grows through experience rather than promotion. Knitting also teaches scale, but not bigness. It teaches human scale, the kind of scale where work fits into life rather than consuming it, where growth does not require erasing the person doing the work, where production expands through participation rather than extraction. Knitting does not demand domination of markets. It does not seek total efficiency. It survives by fitting itself gently into the spaces people actually have. This is why it has endured. Across centuries of change, mechanization, industrialization, digitization, knitting adjusted without losing its core. It remained useful because it respected limits. Limits of time, limits of attention, limits of the human body. Business systems that ignore these limits often burn out. Those that acknowledge them tend to persist. Knitting reminds us that not all work needs to be fast to be meaningful, that not all value needs to be loud to be real, that not all success needs to scale endlessly to matter. Sometimes the strongest systems are the quiet ones, the ones built slowly, maintained carefully, and returned to again and again. In that sense, knitting is not just a craft, it is a lesson, one about patience, about value, and about what it means to build something that lasts at the pace of human hands. Looking ahead, there is no need for predictions. Knitting has never depended on certainty. It has survived without guarantees. It has adapted without rushing toward the future. What lies ahead does not need to be named. What can be noticed instead are gentle possibilities. As the world continues to change, people will still need ways to slow down, to focus attention without strain, to create something tangible in lives that increasingly feel abstract. Knitting already knows how to do this. It does not require reinvention, only continuation. Tools may change, platforms may shift, materials may evolve, but the core remains steady. Hands moving, attention settling, time unfolding. Small businesses will continue to form around these rhythms. Local shops will open and close, but the need they serve will remain. Digital spaces will expand, then reorganize, but the craft will find its place within them. Knitting does not compete for attention. It waits. And when conditions invite it, during moments of uncertainty, restlessness, or renewal, people return. This is not growth driven by urgency. It is growth shaped by need. A quiet future suits knitting well, one where the craft remains available rather than dominant, where participation is voluntary rather than demanded. where value is measured in experience as much as outcome. There is no finish line, only continuation, and that may be the most sustainable path of all. Thank you for spending this time here, whether you listened closely or drifted in and out, or simply let the words move past you as you rested. Your presence matters. Stories like this are meant to be kept company with, not rushed through. They unfold slowly, the way knitting does, one moment following another. No pressure to remember everything, no need to hold on tightly. If you found comfort in this quiet exploration, if this kind of slow, thoughtful business storytelling helps you unwind, you're welcome to subscribe, save the episode, or return another night. It supports the work, and it ensures the story will be here when you need it. And if you didn't catch everything, that's perfectly fine. Nothing here requires full attention. Nothing is lost if you fall asleep. As this story comes to a close, imagine the simplest rhythm: hands moving, yarn passing through fingers, a steady, familiar motion. No beginning, no end, just continuation. If you're still awake, you can rest now. If you've already drifted, that's exactly as it should be. Good night, and may your thoughts slow, your breathing soften, and your rest come easily.